Have you ever felt a moment so quietly strange that you couldn't prove it to anyone else, yet you knew it happened? Not a major event, not a visible turning point, no clear sign you could point to, and still, deep inside, you sensed that you had crossed a boundary. Something inside you stepped over a threshold your mind didn't have a word for. Maybe you felt calmer in a way that didn't feel like relief. Maybe you felt more sensitive, as if the world's volume dropped but your inner hearing sharpened. Maybe you felt as if the world moved one beat farther away, like you were watching life from a slightly new distance. And at the same time, something very light, almost fragile, began to open within you. Not excitement, not triumph, but a clean, quiet newness. For Carl Jung, moments like that are not random. They are not nothing. They are not simply mood changes or temporary phases you should ignore. They are signals from the psyche that something has been completed in the inner world. Jung believed that when a person reaches a certain point in their development, life stops pushing them around in the same unconscious way. The relationship between you and life begins to shift. Instead of being dragged by forces you don't understand, fears, compulsions, old stories, inherited identities, you start moving from a deeper center. Your life begins to respond to you, not just to circumstances. Not because you gain control over everything, but because you become more aligned with what is true inside you. In Jung's language, this happens when a person has passed through a profound inner trial, one that most people avoid, postpone, or numb themselves against. And here is something even more unsettling, and also strangely comforting. You may not fully realize you have passed through it until afterward. Often you only recognize it when you look back and notice you are no longer the same kind of person who entered it. You might not have won anything in the external world. There may be no new job, no new relationship, no dramatic glow-up that announces the transformation. But inside, you can sense that something old has died and something more authentic has started to breathe. You may not be able to explain it, but you can feel it. If these words land in you with an inexplicable resonance, if they feel oddly timed, as if they arrived on the exact day your inner world needed a mirror, Jung would not call that coincidence in the shallow sense. He would say the unconscious communicates when you're finally quiet enough to hear it. He would say that readiness has a way of arranging meetings between your attention and the message that matches it. Not as superstition, not as fate you can outsource responsibility to, but as the psyche's natural pattern-making capacity, the way inner transformation changes what you notice, what you are drawn toward, and what suddenly feels meaningful. There are moments in life when you look back and realize you went through something that no one around you understood, not because they didn't care, but because it didn't look like anything from the outside. It didn't have the structure of a public crisis. It didn't fit the easy categories that make other people comfortable. Breakup, failure, loss, illness, success. It was quieter than that, and in some ways harder to talk about because it was not a single event. It was an inner passage. Jung described a kind of passage like this as the last inner trial, a confrontation with the unconscious that demands honesty, endurance, and a willingness to stay present when the familiar identity begins to crack. From the outside, people might have seen you become withdrawn. They might have assumed you were tired, moody, distracted, unmotivated, or going through a phase. They might have said you were overthinking. They might have told you to get out more, to be positive, to distract yourself, to move on. But inside, what you were facing was not a problem that could be solved by forcing yourself into a better mood. You were facing something structural. The psychological framework you had lived inside of for years, your assumptions, your coping strategies, the roles you played, the mask you wore without realizing it was a mask. Jung believed that the deepest growth does not begin when life gives you more comfort. It begins when the psyche withdraws the comfort you were using to avoid yourself. This is why the final test often doesn't feel like an event. It feels like a season where the usual inner supports stop working. The strategies that once kept you stable lose their power. The things that once gave you meaning go flat. The social roles that once gave you a sense of identity begin to feel like clothes that no longer fit. You start noticing the gap between who you are and who you have been performing, and the gap becomes too loud to ignore. The final test is rarely the obvious outer drama. Losing a job, ending a relationship, failing publicly. Those can be gateways, yes. Those are doors life uses to push you inward. But Jung would say the true confrontation begins after the door closes and you are alone with what remains.
The real test is what happens when you can no longer distract yourself from the psychological structure you built to survive. The real test is the moment you look directly at your own darkness, in the sense not of badness, but in the sense of what has been unconscious, the hidden fear, the denied anger, the buried grief, the unlived desire, the shame you never named, the emptiness you covered with productivity, the loneliness you covered with relationships, the insecurity you covered with competence. Jung famously suggested that enlightenment is not a matter of imagining light, but of making darkness conscious. That sentence is not a motivational quote. It is a map. It is a warning and a promise. It is warning you that the psyche does not mature through fantasy, through spiritual bypassing, or through pretending everything is fine. And it is promising you that if you have the courage to bring what is hidden into awareness, it loses its power to control you from below. Jung used mythic language for this inner descent, sometimes calling it a night sea journey, not because he wanted to romanticize suffering, but because myth gives a structure to experiences that are otherwise hard to describe. The night sea journey is what it feels like when your old identity dissolves and you drift through a dark inner ocean without a map. It is not simply sadness. It is not simply depression. It can include those feelings, but it is deeper than mood. It is the experience of meaning relapsing, of the psyche closing one chapter while you still have not learned how to live the next. Someone once described months where nothing bad was happening externally, that yet internally she felt like life had drained out of her world. Things that once mattered became strangely meaningless. The hobbies that used to light her up felt distant and unreal. She didn't want to socialize. She didn't want to perform her old cheerful self. She didn't even know what she wanted. She thought she was broken. But then she encountered Jung's descriptions and recognized herself. This was not a personal failure. It was a passage, a test not designed for comfort but designed for transformation. If you've known this, you'll recognize the specific sensations. The unusual emptiness, like part of you cracked and you didn't know whether to hold the crack together or let it split open. The frightening silence, where silence feels like exposure, because silence removes your ability to hide from yourself. The repetitive frustration of trying to go back to how things were and realizing the door won't open. You can still physically return to the old routines, but they feel dead. They no longer hold you. They no longer convince you. This is one of the most terrifying aspects of the final test. The old structures die before the new ones are built. And the mind, when it loses structure, panics. The ego panics. The ego is the part of you that maintains a sense of control, a sense of identity, a sense of this is who I am. It fears dissolving. It fears uncertainty. It fears not knowing. It fears if the mask cracks, nothing will be underneath. That fear is not proof you're failing. Jung would say the fear is proof you're in the correct territory. The ego always fights for its life at the edge of transformation. There's a pattern Jung observed. The final test tends to direct you to what you have avoided the longest. People who fear loneliness are pushed into loneliness. People who fear feeling are forced to feel. People who rely on approval lose the audience. People who define themselves through achievement find themselves unable to achieve in the same way. People who hide pain behind humor suddenly can't laugh it off anymore, not because life is punishing them, but because the psyche is trying to break the old structure that keeps them from becoming whole. And this is where most people run. They run not necessarily by leaving physically, but by drowning themselves in noise. They work more, they date more, they scroll more, they buy more. They overstimulate the nervous system so they don't have to hear the quiet truth rising from within. They create a constant hum because silence becomes too honest. But if you have ever stayed, if you have ever chosen even a few minutes of stillness a day when everything in you wanted to escape, you have done something not everyone dares to do. You have done the rare thing. You have remained present when your psyche asked for truth. And Jung would say that is how the final test is passed, not by winning, not by conquering, not by performing strength, but by refusing to abandon yourself. Passing the final test doesn't usually feel like instant happiness. It is subtler than that. It can feel like a slight loosening in the chest. It can feel like waking up and noticing your breath is easier. It can feel like something that used to terrify you no longer grips you with the same intensity. It can feel like a relationship that once wounded you becomes clear as if fog lifted. It can feel like an old shell falling away, quietly, without a dramatic story to attach it to it. It's the moment you realize you are no longer fighting to be who you used to be. That quiet shift is what Jung meant by a kind of inner rebirth, the true self beginning to emerge after the old ego has cracked. Not the true self as a perfect version of you, but the true self as a more honest, more integrated, less performed version of you. The self that can carry contradictions, the self that can hold grief without drown it, the self that can contain anger without acting it out unconsciously, the self that can be alone without collapsing, the self that can say no without needing to justify, the self that can accept imperfection without shame. And if you feel that these words are meeting you in a strangely precise way, as if they arrived exactly when you needed them, that matters, not as a superstition, but as a psychological marker. When your inner frequency changes, you begin noticing different things. You begin recognizing language that you previously skimmed over. You begin being drawn toward messages that match what is unfolding inside you. Jung would sometimes call that a meaningful coincidence. But even without the mystical framing, it is simply true that inner change alters perception.
Often comes
After the
with
Night Sea
confusion,
journey closes its
because the
first door,
mind wants
people often enter
certainty.
one of the deepest
It wants to know
transformations,
who you are,
ego collapse.
what you're doing,
Ego
what
collapse.
it all means. When identity loosens, you can feel chaotic, directionless, raw. You might feel emotions more intensely. You might feel more sensitive to criticism. You might feel more tired. You might feel like you're not yourself. But what's actually happening is that you are no longer the old self, and the new self is still forming. Jung said there is no coming to consciousness without pain. That pain does not mean you are doomed. It means you are being stripped of illusion. Illusion always resists being removed, but when it falls away, a new kind of clarity arrives. People who pass through ego collapse often report that afterward, the world looks different. Not necessarily brighter, not necessarily easier, but clearer. Things that once mattered lose their grip. Things that once terrified you no longer own you. A quiet space opens inside you. And in that space, you start noticing something else. Small, meaningful patterns that feel like the world is responding to your inner shift. Jung called this synchronicity, meaningful coincidence. After the ego loosens and the inner space opens, many people begin noticing repeating numbers, recurring phrases, strangely timed encounters, books opening to the exact sentence they needed, songs playing at the right moment, conversations that feel uncannily relevant. Jung would not say that the universe is spoiling you with signs in a childish way. He would say that when your inner world changes, you become sensitive to patterns, and those patterns can carry meaning. The unconscious speaks in symbols, and when the ego stops drowning everything out, symbolism becomes visible. What makes synchronicity feel sacred is that it arrives when you are quiet enough to receive it. When your mind is noisy with the old ego, proving, performing, chasing, defending, you don't notice. But after ego collapse, after the silence, after the cracking, you begin to see details. You begin to feel that something is trying to reveal itself through what looks small. Someone described repeatedly seeing the same image again and again until it felt like it was following them. At first, they dismissed it as coincidence, but repetition presses a question into your awareness. Why now? And sometimes that question becomes the door. Synchronicity is not the full answer. It is the thread you were given so you don't abandon the path. Like the red thread in myths. Not dramatic, not magical, but strangely essential. But Jung also warned, you are not meant to chase synchronicity compulsively. You are meant to recognize it. It is not a substitute for responsibility. It is a mirror. It is a sign that your psyche is moving into a new phase. It's confirmation that you are no longer living entirely in the old stage. And then, often, the deeper work begins, shadow integration. The shadow is not the bad part of you. It is the denied part of you, the part you learned to hide because you believed it would cost you love, belonging, safety, or approval. It contains anger you labeled unacceptable, desire you labeled shameful, sensitivity you labeled weak, ambition you labeled selfish, grief you labeled inconvenient. The shadow is made of everything you pushed into the dark to be acceptable. When ego collapse happens, you can no longer keep it buried.
The psyche will not allow you to become whole while you remain split. So the shadow rises, not to punish you, but to be included. Jung said that knowing your own darkness is the best way to deal with the darkness of other people, because when you deny your shadow, you become vulnerable to it. You project it. You act it out unconsciously. You become controlled by what you refuse to see. Imagine walking into a room you locked for years. You expected something terrifying, but when you turn on the light, you see old belongings, parts of your life you abandoned. The shadow is like that. It's rarely a monster. It's often pain. It's often unmet need. It's often a truth you didn't have permission to hold. And the moment you look without running, transformation begins. A person once believed they were always kind, always caring, always giving. Then, during inner transformation, they began snapping in anger and felt ashamed, terrified they were becoming bad. But then a deeper truth surfaced. Perhaps the kindness had been partially built on fear. Fear of abandonment, fear of being disliked, fear of rejection. When they recognized the fear beneath the kindness, they cried, not from shame, but from relief, because what is seen loses its hidden power. The shadow does not need you to hate it, it needs you to acknowledge it. Shadow integration for Jung is not about erasing your darkness. It is about giving it a seat at the table so it stops sabotaging from the basement. You become whole not by becoming perfect, but by becoming honest. And Jung emphasized, you cannot force shadow integration. You don't rip yourself open violently. You meet one piece with courage, honesty, and softness. You look at one fragment you avoided, and the next fragment opens naturally. Darkness loses power when it is illuminated by awareness. And then another shift begins to happen, quiet but profound, the withdrawal of projections. Before maturity, people often live as if the world is the cause of their inner pain. They made me insecure. They made me anxious. They hurt me. They ruined my confidence. Jung did not deny that people can harm each other, but he observed that much of our ongoing suffering comes from unconscious projection. We place old wounds onto present situations. We interpret reality through the lens of unresolved pain. Jung said everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. The moment you stop asking, why are they like this, and start asking, why does this hit me so deeply, you cross a threshold. That question is not self-blame, it is power. It is the moment you begin reclaiming your emotional authority. When you withdraw projections, you begin seeing people as they are, not as your past paints them. You begin separating childhood fear from adult reality. You begin recognizing that your reactions often belong to older stories. And when you recognize that, you stop handing other people the keys to your nervous system. You stop living as if the world gets to decide who you are. This does not make you indifferent. It makes you clear. It makes you steady. It makes you quietly powerful. You become less reactive, less easily hooked, less likely to enter battles that are not yours. You stop being pulled around by other people's emotions. You start living from an internal foundation. Someone once believed colleagues judged them constantly. Meetings felt like threats. Feedback felt like rejection. They thought the problem was the environment, but then during inner work, they noticed the deeper wound, a childhood fear of not being good enough. The colleagues were not the original wound, they were the trigger. When the person saw this, the world did not immediately change, but their lens did. And because the lens changed, the world felt different. That is what it means to reclaim projections. The outer world stops being a battlefield and becomes a mirror. After this, a new orientation begins. Life starts quietly restructuring itself around who you are becoming. People often expect transformation to announce itself with drama, miracles, fireworks, instant success. But Jung would say the real shift is quieter and more precise. Relationships that once felt familiar begin to drift, not with a fight, but with a natural distance because you no longer share the same frequency. A job that once felt safe starts feeling too small. You feel drawn to something you cannot yet fully name. Intuition becomes sharper. Choices become simpler. What aligns with you begins to feel obvious, and what does not align begins to fall away without as much struggle. It can feel like a magnet flipping. You change at the center, and the pattern of your life reorganizes, not because you are forcing it, but because you are no longer compatible with what you used to settle for. And then, sometimes, something strange happens. What is meant for you begins to find you. Doors open with less pushing. Conversations appear at the right time. Opportunities arrive without you begging them, not because you became more lucky, but because you stopped chasing what was never yours. Alignment does that. Honesty does that. And then comes what Jung might call the gift after the final test. Not constant happiness, not dramatic success. The gift is inner stability, a deep inner peace that does not depend on external validation. It does not feel like victory. It feels like standing in your own life without needing to prove you deserve to be there. It feels like returning to your rightful place inside yourself. This peace arrives softly, like air after a storm. You are not immune to pain, but you are less controlled by fear. Things that used to trigger your defenses pass through you more quickly. You communicate more gently. You choose more wisely. You move slower but surer, not because you are trying to be spiritually evolved, but because you are no longer being driven by unconscious wounds. Imagine a lake after a storm. When the wind stops, the surface becomes still, and in that stillness, the water reflects the sky more clearly than ever. The peace after the final test is like that.